Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Malka Williams, and thank you for joining the Design Lab's first anti-racism studio session series. This talk is about the power, privilege, and ethical responses. Excuse me. Ethical responses, anti-racism series, comprising 14 studio sessions where we address the question, how might we design from whiteness to oneness? Through these sessions, we encourage actively looking through our personal and collective lens to rethink and develop new lenses in the redesigning process. We want to take a deep dive at how we arrive at whiteness through all the structures and how it is essential to move away from this to a design that is for all, designing from whiteness to oneness in humanity. We hope to share tools that address the experiences of our Black community in hopes of bridging existing gaps between the historical present and current calls to action. These sessions will provide participants with dialogue and tools that enhance the thinking, communication, and self-reflection of participants. We hope to address and work through these issues in real time through engagement that enhances empathy and ethical responsibility. The goal is to increase awareness on social justice issues and stand by the community's team's value of ethical design for change. To follow up with the education provided, we plan to incorporate actionable items for change at UCSD and in our local communities in San Diego. At this time, we will ask for our Assistant Director at the Design Lab, Michelle, to say a few words.
Happy to do so. I just want to thank everyone for taking time out of your schedules to be here, for us to share this space, to discuss this incredibly important topic, not only now, but always. And we're so privileged to have Ima here kicking off this first studio session with us. I think you will be, if you have not met her, you will see that she really embodies the spirit of, I believe, why we are all here today. I also want to say a special thank you to Mika Marzette and to Malka Williams, to Bassam, and everyone on the community team in the Design Lab, and the faculty advisors who've helped us bring this series together. We are a community, all of us. And so for those of you who are coming in who are not members of the Design Lab, we are thrilled to be with you. This is a conversation. It is open, we are candid, we are safe, and we are really excited to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. And now we'll be introducing our speaker. Ymasumac Marañón Davis is a writer, educational consultant, university lecturer, and intuitive life coach. Her ancestry comes from the Quechua people of Bolivia and pilgrims of New England. She has been a teacher, administrator, and published author and international speaker. Ymassumac's projects explores creating a culturally relevant pedagogy, storytelling, the impact of emotions in our learning structures, and please welcome Ymasumac Marañón Davis.
Thank you so much. Yeah, again, my name is Ymasumac, but many people call me Ima, so please feel free to call me Ima as well. I've asked my father, I said, Ymasumac's pretty intense. What, is there another option? And he said, Ima is okay, or sumac. And sumac is either an herb or a spice, depending on where you're from. So I said, Ima's okay. So I want to make sure that I acknowledge, I always want to start with acknowledging the land that we're on. I'm very grateful that Sue did that in the chat group from where she is. And I know that we're in various places. And so wherever you're standing, I always, say, if you look out the window or if you look out the door and if you see, this beautiful mountain, this, beautiful ocean, a beautiful tree, that, there were people here for 10,000 years taking care of this land. And we're just very grateful. We're very grateful that we get to participate and be on this land today. And hopefully through this process that we're all going through, both nationally, but globally, that we're going to restructure society in a way that really acknowledges all people and their contributions, right? So that it won't continue to be only gratitude, but there will be a great deal of justice as well that goes with when we work with people, especially Native people or people from the original land. So I just want to make sure I always acknowledge. But let me get started. And when I do, I also want to say that, I think that I try to approach any space that I'm in which I'm having a conversation as an active participant and learner with everyone else. I firmly believe that we're all kind of part of a learning process. Some of us may be a little bit ahead in some areas, but others are ahead in other areas. And so I really appreciate how the Design Lab has organized this so that there's an interactive part to this as well. And so I'm going to share what I have learned up to this point. By no means is this an exhaustive presentation. This is one aspect of how we can approach this conversation. And then, of course, there'll be many more that'll come not only today, but after today. So when we start this conversation, I want to ask you to consider looking at it through two aspects. And this is a way that I always approach addressing racism, because racism is so complex. And if we're going to address it, we need to address it at minimum on two levels, right? So one, as an individual, right? As an individual, I need to think about what does it mean when I am personally injured, right? When somebody, personally says something that offends me, how is my response? And at a personal level, my belief, our response is that we have to learn how to love each other, right? So if somebody offends me, then it's my job to work with that person to help shift that conversation, right? But at an institutional level, it's different, because an institutional level is in charge of taking care of the community. And so when there's institutional oppression, it needs to be addressed through an institutional lens. In other words, other institutions need to address it, right? And so to me, when I think about the demonstrations that we've seen, when we hear calls for, refunding police in a different way, what I hear is that we're really looking at an institutional approach to addressing institutional oppression. At an individual level, I still have a responsibility one-on-one with the rest of humanity, right? And so I want to mention that because the personal level often gets confused with institutional. And when I speak of these, I'm very clear that oppression for a community is not okay, right? Because for oppression for a community, then oppressions everybody. However, I also understand that at an individual level, people are coming from different places, and if somebody says something that's offensive, then I feel my job is to learn how to work with them to get closer to love, to get closer to trust, and to build a sense of humility among each other, right? Because as human beings, we're coming from really different walks towards this same place. So just keeping that in mind, and the rest of the conversation, kind of think about like which one is individual, which one is personal, because that's really important when we walk through this lens. And so with that in mind, one of the things that I also want to think about is how do we really look at, how do we see the world through through two lenses, right? And I think that's what we do. We look at the world actually through multiple lenses, right? And so we see the world often when we walk out into the world, we have this filter that's in front of us, right? And this filter is formed by our belief systems, by the stories that we're told, or by the false narratives that we carry inside of ourselves, right? Or by life experiences, right? If we've had trauma or if we have abuse, right? All these shape our filter, right? And so when I look out into the world, I see something that I think is truth may not actually be that, right? I don't know. right? And so it's a lens in which I'm looking through. And if you're a person of color, most likely you have at minimum 2 lenses, right? Chances are you have multiple, but at minimum you have 2, because there is a dominant culture in which all of us walk through. And the people who are most aware of this culture are people of color. When we walk through it, we are aware of it. We know it exists. We know it asks something different of us than maybe my home culture asks of me. It asks me to speak differently. It asks me to express myself differently. It asks me to move differently, even to dress differently, right? So this dominant culture is also a lens. It's a filter that filters my world, right? And so some of the expressions that can come from this dominant culture, for example, is it can filter my world as somebody who identifies on my father's side as Indigenous Latina. It can filter that world by expressions like, ay, mira qué bonita, es güerita, which means, you know, oh, look at how beautiful she is. She's light-skinned, right? That came from the dominant culture, right? It's this lens that filtered into my language, right? And it infiltrated what we see as beautiful or desirable, right? So these different lenses impact the way that we see the world. And the more awareness we can build around the fact that these lenses exist, then the more consciousness we can have about how we express ourselves, being mindful of what it is that we're saying out loud, right? And how we're participating in the world. Ultimately, my belief is that what we're experiencing is a systematic creation of a world that was built on a lens of whiteness, right? So I just mentioned all these different lenses. And we know that colonization impacted the entire world, right? There was no part of the world that escaped colonization, right? And so colonization had this lens of whiteness. And what it said is that this is what's on top. This is what the prize is. This is what you want. And then it would kind of go down from there, right? Based on like a color scale, right? And all the values that we attributed to that color scale, right? So we valued as pure, as good, as desirable, that which is on the top part of that pyramid, which would be the whitest aspect of it, right? And so white isn't necessarily just a color, it's also a value system, right? And everything was measured against this. Now, one of the reasons why I always bring this up is because often, and we're going to talk more about this today, people look at this lens and say, oh, you know, then that means that all white people are the winners. No, nobody wins. Nobody wins in this lens, right? Because this is an unattainable kind of level of perfection, so to speak, right? It also breeds competition, right? And that's something that we prize ourselves a great deal with in this country, in particular in the West. We think that competition is what fuels things like economy and education. In reality, what competition does is that it pits us against each other, and it creates an otherness. It creates a division, right? If I'm going to exceed and I'm going to become excellent under competition, that means I have to find somebody that I'm comparing myself to, right? And in our current reality, with such a strong kind of lens that filters all of our vision with this vision of whiteness, it also means that I'm competing with whiteness, right? And so I could never be excellent to my true nature because I'm competing with something that is not real. It's a false narrative, right? And so what does this do then? What does this lens do? And how do we keep it going? Because we keep it going. We're all invested in this. And that's why it's so important to talk about it and to develop consciousness around it, right? So the impact of whiteness, right? At individual and institutional levels. So I want you, when I share this, I want you to reflect about what does this look like in my individual life, and what does this look like at an institutional level, right? The impact of the lens of whiteness asks everyone to be silent about it. let's not talk about it, right? And we know that because we're super uncomfortable about talking about it, right? Nobody wants to talk about this is happening. We all kind of want to just keep going, and no, right? If you say something, you might get, you're overreacting, right? So at an individual level in your home, we don't talk about racism. We don't talk about how it impacts our family. We don't talk about how it impacts our children, right? And at an institutional level, we don't talk about what it looks like in schools, what it looks like in our prison system, right? So that leads to the next one, which is avoidance. We avoid it. We find ways to walk away from it, right? In order to keep this system in power, we have to avoid it and pretend it's not happening, right? We also mask, pretend, right? You put this mask on, like, no, everything's okay, we're doing all right, right? So we pretend in our homes that it really isn't happening, that we're really okay. No, it's not, I didn't, choose this hair color because of whiteness, right? Or because I've been told that's beautiful. And same thing institutionally, right? I mean, we have so much data that tells us that this system exists, and yet we're kind of so questioning, does it, right? So it's a form of masking, of pretending that it doesn't, right? Also in the system of whiteness, or in this system of oppression, you need the aspect of controlling, right? You need to be able to control not only information, but you need to control people, right? And so, and you see the systems that are designed for that, right? We have systems designed for control. People are shamed, right, when they behave in ways that we don't consider appropriate according to the dominant culture, right? We find people are pushed out of systems, right, when they're not behaving in ways that we feel are appropriate to, again, the dominant culture. We see this in particular in schools, right? In schools, students are asked to behave according to white middle-class culture, and if they express in different ways, then they're pushed out of that system. And that's why we have alternative education. I love alternative education. I think that's where like the real thinkers are, because they're thinking differently. They're like questioning, they're wondering, right? And so they're not quite fitting within the system that was designed to control a certain way of thinking and a certain way of behaving. We're desperately trying to shift that within that system. However, without this conversation, it's very difficult. And again, that system has a hard time having this conversation for all the things that we just talked about, right? Through the lens of whiteness, we also have labeling, right? So we need to have labels, what kind of person is this person? What kind of sticker? So that's where stereotypes come from, right? This group of people, they're this way, right? We make decisions about people. So labeling becomes a way of sustaining this system, of maintaining it, right? And then attacking, right? We attack people when they don't conform to the system, when they don't participate within it, right? And so these are all ways in which we keep this system going, right? There's no room for consultation. There's no room for us to come together and say, is this right? Is this really serving all of us? There's no room for that, right? Because otherwise then you're going to question the way this system of whiteness works, and then all the other systems are going to begin to crumble, which is what we're beginning to see, right? We're beginning to see these systems shaking because it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable to maintain a system that is oppressing, so many aspects of humanity, right? And that includes everyone, which we're going to talk about, how this happens. And in order to talk about how this happens, I want to talk a little bit about the power of words, because words shape culture, right? And just a minute ago, I talked about all the elements that become part of this cultural narrative. Well, we have to keep that going, right? We have to somehow keep that going. And so I have these two quotes here because, all the spiritual traditions of the past have talked about the power of words and how words are endowed with a spirit. Just expressing a word, right, can reverberate and impact large swaths of areas. Indigenous people say that it affects the land. The actual land can feel the words that you say, right? And so these were things that were taught by our prophets, right? These are not things that just come to us. And Even something like that, even something like talking about, you know, what spirit, something that's spiritual, the system of whiteness has kind of like co-opted that word and said, no, we can't talk about that, right? That's not something we can talk about because they've decided religion is this thing that's over here. And it's not part of just the way that we move in society, right? It's not part of the way that we relate and we connect to each other, right? And many of our Native brothers and sisters understand that. They understand it's the way that we move, and they've been holding that rhythm for us. And so how do we learn to get back into that rhythm, right? So that we can become more holistic with the way that we relate to each other as spirit beings, right? And so the other quote that I was really struck by in one of my beloved sisters from the Navajo Nation shared this with me when she knew I was going to, you know, share with you all about the power of words. She said, you got to share this quote. And I said, okay. And it's this one over here by Ijeoma, where it says, the history of a word matters as long as the effects of that history are still felt. You know, and so I thought that was so powerful, because one of the things she shared with me, she said, you know, I know that we use words like pioneer because we think of like somebody who's going out into an unknown area. And she said, but for us, the effects of that history is still felt today. And it's why it's still hard. And I was like, oh, it's so enlightening, right? And I thought, wow, okay. And so then be mindful of that, right? So when we listen to each other, and we listen to each other's stories, and we listen to our reality, right? And we acknowledge it, then we can not only be mindful, but then together we can move forward, right? So that we can create new meaning for words, right? So that words can develop a new spirit, right? That is based on love and oneness, and can release the spirit of oppression that was placed on that word, that kind of co-opted it and took it away from us, so that we could no longer use it. And so words actually create systems and establish culture. And so this, you know, this is comes from Michelle Alexander's work in understanding, you know, in particular, you know, our mass incarceration that we have in this country. And in the new Jim Crow, you know, this is something she mentioned that again struck me when, you know, my son and I were, you know, he was sharing, he was reading this book and he was talking about this with me. And, you know, just knowing that, you know, the first English people and the first Europeans, when they came here, and they their first relationship with the native people, right, with the indigenous people, you know, it maybe initially, you know, was not contentious. However, when whatever the Europeans' ideas were of what they wanted no longer worked with what the indigenous people that were already here had, right? They changed the language around who they were. And they decided that they were now savage people. And by just that one word, by just shifting the word to savage, they could now then say, it's okay to remove them from their land. It's okay to systematically eliminate them because they're a savage people. And it became culturally acceptable to do this, right, across the country, right? The Americas, in South America, they chose a different system. However, it was not necessarily kinder. It was not necessarily inclusive either, right? They were still a lesser people, right? And so just the language, just one word changed the whole culture around how we interacted with another segment of humanity. And I think this is really powerful, because if you don't know the story of what happened to the native people on this land, I want to mention one very small story. And it was, I believe it was the Lakota Sioux, where there was a two-year-old little native boy, you know, and this is where, you know, already the soldiers of the Europeans had come and were just, you know, decimating this village. And there was a 2-year-old boy that was looking for his mother, of course, and crying. And one of the soldiers thought it would be fun to use that 2-year-old as target practice. Now, when I think of that and how revolting that is, right? You can only do that if you truly believe that these people are not human as you are. They're not equal to you. That's the power of words, right? This person that was deciding this didn't come up with this. They weren't born this way, right? If oneness of humanity is oneness of humanity, that's everybody. Everybody's in, right? So then this person was not born this way. However, somewhere along the line, that narrative became his, and it gave him a reason to say, it's okay to do this, right? And so that's how dangerous this becomes, right? So we want to be really mindful of this. So how does this happen, right? You know, how do words then become so powerful? And so here are a few examples I wanted to share, because I think that, you know, in the work that I do with storytelling in particular, when I think of storytelling, I think of two kinds of storytelling. What are the inner narratives that I'm telling myself, right? And how close are those inner narratives to the truth of who I am? And what are the social narratives that we're telling, right? We're telling about others. And also what are the social narratives that people are telling about me, right? Because the stronger my inner narratives are about the truth of who I am, the less these social narratives have impact, right? It doesn't mean we don't change them. We still have to work. Remember, it's not an either or dichotomy. It's not, I only work on individual or I only work on institutional. We work on them both, right? However, this inner narrative is so important, right? And here are some examples of that. So in this first one, which is this one here, there's a strong narrative, it's a social narrative that we've constructed around Black men. And that social narrative is that they're inherently athletic, right? And that's their gift, that's their thing, right? And so Claude Steele from Stanford does a lot of work in this area. And so he ran a lot of tests in this area just to, you know, really see like the stereotype threat, how does it work, right? And so in this example, he said that he took some men, you know, Black and white, and brought them into a setup kind of studio where he had like a little golfing, you know, one of those like home golfing centers. And he asked them to just, you know, I'm not good at golfing, so I don't know, what is it, puck the ball? It's like push the little ball into wherever it's supposed to go, right? And so, what he did though is right before they were going to go do it, he would tell them something specific. And so to Black men, what he said to them was, oh, you were invited here because of your natural athletic ability, right? And so they would just kind of plant that little stereotype threat in there. And because it's a stereotype that they may have already believed, when they told them that, they did well when they did the golf test. They nailed it every time, first time. And there's videos of this, you can look this up on YouTube. And they were so like, yes, you know, I'm nailing this. They were so proud of themselves, right? And then they would take other people and then they would say, same thing, Black man, and they would say, right before they started, they say, oh, by the way, we know this is a highly complex game that requires a great deal of like intelligence and just, you know, complex thinking, you know, so we just wanted to like make sure we let you know that, you know, before you start playing. And because of that social narrative, that's what before was done well, they missed it every time. They wouldn't get the ball in. They struggled, right? And he saw this again and again. And he did this test with women, and you know, the stereotypes around women. And again, if they were told the stereotype before, whatever the issue was, right? For women, often it was things like math and things like in science, they did poorly. But if they told them something else that was just, you know, positive, then you know, they did well, right? And so I think about that and I think, man, how many things are we hearing throughout the day? And if we don't know the truth about who we are, right, that we're truly noble beings created with incredible capacity and gifts, right, then these narratives seep in and we begin to believe them, right? There's another narrative, and it, again, equally decimating to communities. And I have a small video clip that I wanted to share with you. If you haven't seen Smoke Signals, I suggest you do. It's written by a Native writer. It's directed and produced. It has an all-Native cast. It's absolutely fabulous. But this small clip really helps us understand how, again, the stereotype threat around this noble savage, right, which is what Native people often have to carry when they walk out in society, and how decimating that is, because it robs them of being who they truly are, right? And whatever it is that they have inside, whatever gift that they have inside can get, it can get squashed because of this other kind of mask that they have to put on, right? So I'm just gonna play this, it's a very short clip. Hopefully you can hear it okay.
Hey, Victor, what do you remember about your dad? I remember one time we had this fry bread eating contest, and he ate 15 pieces of fry bread. It was cool.
You know, Thomas, I don't know what you're talking about half the time. Why is that?
I don't know.
I mean, you just go on and on talking about nothing. Why can't you have a normal conversation? You're always trying to sound like some damn medicine man or something. I mean, how many times have you seen Dances with Wolves? 100, 200? Oh, geez. You have seen it that many times, haven't you? Don't you even know how to be a real Indian?
I guess not.
Well, shit, no wonder. Geez. I guess I'll have to teach you then, ain't it? First of all, quit grinning like an idiot. Indians ain't supposed to smile like that. Get stoic. No, like this. You gotta look mean or people won't respect you. White people will run all over you if you don't look mean. You gotta look like a warrior. You gotta look like you just came back from killing a buffalo.
But our tribe never hunted buffalo. We were fishermen.
What? You wanna look like you just came back from catching a fish? This ain't Dances with Salmon, you know. Thomas, you gotta look like a warrior. There, that's better. And second, you gotta know how to use your hair.
My hair?
Yeah, I mean, look at your hair. It's all braided up and stuff. You gotta free it. An Indian man ain't nothing without his hair. And last, you gotta get rid of that suit, Thomas. You just have to.
So, this is such a wonderful example of what happens, what happens to a community that is told, this is the appropriate way. This is what it means to look like your people, whatever your people are, right? And we begin to be confined, to these roles that we have to play. The effects, the devastating effects of stereotype threat, I cannot tell you how it impacts families, communities. This is in part why mass incarceration works so well, right? Because of these effects. Another thing that often comes up when we have this conversation, and this is a particularly strong irritant for me, is that when we think about racism, or we think about the systems of oppression, we often think about people of color. Oh, so sad, poor people of color, like they're really, really suffering, as if white people don't suffer under the system of oppression, as if they're not affected, right? And this is real important for me, because it can get us to a place that we have to be very careful about, because it can posture us towards paternalism, right? I, the beneficiary of racism, feel bad for you who have not benefited from this, right? And although that may be true in a material lens, right? Because in a material lens, we could say, absolutely, who has land wealth, right? All the historic trauma, all of that. But from a spiritual lens, right? If you look at these communities, truly, who is walking with so many incredible gifts of faith, of joy, of trust, despite these circumstances. I am always in awe, of communities of color, and how they continue to move forward in spite of these circumstances, with so many incredible gifts to teach us about. And so this is one example of how I think the systems of oppression devastate white communities as well. So this is an example of Black Wall Street. And if you don't know the story of Black Wall Street, again, I really encourage you to Google it. So this is after the right after slavery ended in the Reconstruction era, and Black communities began to really like come together and lean on each other and support each other and build up these really beautiful, strong communities. This is one example. There's a few of these examples throughout the country about strong Black communities that really formed. Whole cities. Mayor is Black. They had their own banks. They had wealth. They had doctors. They had dentists. All a strong Black community, right? And you think about that in spite of what they went through. Through 400 years. It's always to me, just really incredibly inspiring. However, and this is a picture of this the city of Black Wall Street, or what's often referred to as Black Wall Street. And the neighboring town, right, which is a white community, became very jealous and upset about this. And so what they did, and this is where, the very first, what was recorded as a riot, right? And this is the very first idea of what riots are. They came in and they just absolutely decimated this community and they burned it down, right? And as you would imagine, there were no repercussions, right, for this behavior. So what does that do to a people that you can do this kind of damage and have no repercussions? I believe what it does is it allows your ego to go unchecked. Right? So you have this ego that thinks it can do anything, right? And when you have an unchecked ego, that is so dangerous, right? It's incredibly dangerous, right? It's where we begin to see things like, that serial killers, the majority of serial killers are white, right? You begin to see white and male, what did I say? You begin to see things like what we've seen with mass shootings in school, right? Young white boys from upper middle class communities, right? Just going in and just shooting down schools, right? So, to me, those are reflections of egos that have gone unchecked, right? Our egos need to be checked. We need to be humbled and in a natural way, not in an oppressive way. And so this to me is an example of institutional oppression. This is not an individual oppression. This is institutional, because another community came in and tried to obliterate a whole community, right? That's an example of institutional oppression and should be dealt with by other institutions, right? Things like not only people, being held accountable for what they did, but also money being given back to the community to rebuild, right? That's how we kind of address institutional oppression, which is different than individual personal injury, right? And so I just want to keep mentioning that. Another thing that I often hear from my friends, who are Anglo, they'll say things like, but it wasn't my ancestors, who did this, I'm a recent immigrant, or my grandparents were recent immigrants, or, something like that. And my thought often is, yeah, that's the legacy of white supremacy, is that everybody's going to be swathed under it, right? So if you're white, whether or not your ancestors were here, that system doesn't care. You're going to be held accountable to it. Just as if you're a person of color, whether or not, you are whatever that stereotype is, you're going to be held accountable to that stereotype. Young Black men are going to be held accountable to the stereotype about young Black men. I'm going to be held accountable to this idea of being a noble savage, right? Those are the stereotypes that this system holds us all under. So my thought is, you don't like it, it's not fair, you're right. So let's change that system, because we've all been living under it, right, for 400 years. And it's something that needs to be addressed and changed, right? So along with how words decimate and how they truly strip everyone of their nobility, right? They strip all human beings of anything that allows us to interact and behave as noble and loving human beings. What these narratives also do is that they demand that everything be sanitized through whiteness in order to be acceptable. Now, unless you're a person of color, this can seem like a very difficult concept to understand. I imagine, I don't know, but it's something that I feel like I often have to explain, because it's something that I experience so much, and it's very frustrating, right? So I want to give some examples to share about how this shows up, and know that these are very few examples, because it happens, 100 times, in probably, a couple weeks time, I will hear examples of things that have to have been sanitized through whiteness in order for society to say, yes, now we accept it. They won't, otherwise it's alternative, right? It's like alternative medicine, right? Like ancient Chinese medicine that has been around for 5,000 years is alternative, right? But Western medicine is a doctor, right? Ancient Chinese medicine are doctors, right? Medicine men who have been around for 10,000 years on this land are doctors, right? But we don't see them that way unless it's been sanitized through this system of whiteness, right? And so, some examples of this, I talked about these inner narratives, right? And so being sanitized through whiteness means that instead of cooperation, I need you to compete, right? Because that's bred by individualism, right? We're not going to work collectively as a unit. Instead, we're going to compete with each other because we think that's the way we generate upward mobility, right? When in reality, it only degenerates humanity into behaving in ways that often even animals don't behave in, right? There's a constant comparison that begins to happen. And, because of the age that we live in, which is not only, I call it the age of transition, but it's also the age of technology, right? We have social media, which is just a reflection of humanity. So I'm never mad at social media, because I know that social media just reflects what's happening inside of the human being. And so if we don't like what we see on social media, then we work with the human being so we can transform the human being so they can push out a different narrative. And so, if you look at social media, there's a constant comparison that happens, right? They've got this, how come I don't have this? They have this level of education, I don't have that level of education. So this constant back and forth of, this continuous comparison that we do, right? And it's all against the standards of whiteness, right? What whiteness determines as okay or as acceptable, right? And it leaves individuals feeling not good enough, right? This concept, this belief of not good enough is something in the healing work that I've done, I have seen across the board. And I've worked with people from, all communities, both socioeconomic and ethnic. And that belief, that false belief of I'm not good enough has shown up in every single one of them. And I firmly believe it's because of this system. The system breeds that into us, right? And it decimates us, right, if we believe it. Now, that's individual. How about socially? Right? And so here are a few social narratives that had to be sanitized through whiteness in order to be okay. So one of them, I already mentioned this doctors versus medicine women, right? We consider Western doctors as just doctors. We don't call them Western doctors. We call them doctors. And then everybody else is, some, whatever their ethnic alliance is, right? If Ayurvedic medicine, would be East Indian, right? Like these are like things that you try out and see, right? As opposed to going to them as like a real doctor, right? That's the language that we use, right? I remember when I was growing up, one of the things that my father used to always tell me is, and he would put a lot of hot, when Bolivia, you use what's called yahua, and yahua is like it's our salsa, right? And so we put a lot of yahua and hot peppers on it, right? And as a child, my sister and I'd be like, it's so hot, and we were like, crying because it's so like spicy. And my father would say, no, hijita, cómelo, it's good for you. And he said, it's going to make your stomach strong, and it's going to make you smart. So you have to eat it. And so my sister and I were, okay, we're going to eat it, right? Because we wanted those things. And, the native people here in this country, when they would travel, they had a little medicine pouch that they would carry, and they would have peppers in there, in particular cayenne pepper, and they would just chew on it a little bit while they were traveling, because it would help their digestive system as they were traveling and they were being exposed to different kind of, parasites and different kinds of bacteria, and it would kind of keep them strong, right? And so these were all things that were, I grew up with and I understood as true, but when I shared them, they were always received as, well, it's what your grandma says, it's alternative, right? Until there was an article that came out in one of the Western medicine journals, and it mentioned, all the healing effects of cayenne pepper. And then suddenly it was renowned, and it was kind of announced to the world, like cayenne pepper is wonderful for your digestive system. It helps you get, right? And, when you're having a cold, it cuts through the phlegm, all these things, right? And for me, the problem is not so much who gets the credit. There is some concern there, but it's not so much that as Western medicine tends to be a little slower than other medicines. And so we have to wait for that kind of sanction or approval. And meanwhile, so much of humanity could have benefited from that information ahead of time, right? And I often wonder about that. Like, how much more could we advance if we just collaborated with all the medicines, right? If all the medicines collaborated, if we collaborated with the medicine men, if we collaborated with, Chinese medicine, how much faster could we advance and give credit when we collaborate, right? And give financial credit when we collaborate, right? Then humanity could advance so much quicker, right? And so many diseases could probably be addressed, right? I often think about what we're going through now with COVID-19, right? If that collaboration happened, could there be something that, most likely there's a medicine man in a rainforest who understands a great deal about herbs and plants that could help us understand how to address this virus and what it's doing to us. But we don't tap into them because we don't see them as equal to a Western doctor. And so we have to sanitize everything, right, through this white lens before we say, yes, now it gets a stamp of approval. And it just slows everything down, right? Another thing, story I want to mention is the scientific method. I also often teach at universities, and I was at a meeting. They asked faculty of color to come to this meeting because they were really trying to figure out, how do we get more diversity in the sciences, right? They wanted more diversity in the sciences. And so they're saying, can we develop programs, to reach out to the high schools, really focus on Latino and Black students, what can we do to get more Black and Latino students in the sciences, right? And so one of the things that they said was, maybe we can start a program that would teach them the scientific method early on. So by the time they got to the university, they already had the language, they already knew how to work in a lab, right? And so at that point I raised my hand because I was really concerned where the direction this was going. And I shared with them, I said, what you're really saying is that you think that science is only viewed through a Western lens and can only be done through the scientific method of the West. And so what you're asking is for all these Black and brown children who come from really powerful cultures to be assimilated early on into an understanding of science, so that by the time they arrive at the university, they have been stripped of all their cultural learnings and understandings and only have a Western lens in which to participate in science. And I said, and of course you can do that, but how unfortunate for us if that's the way we go, because we will thoroughly miss what these communities have to offer, right? The Mayans, were doing science long before the Europeans were doing science, right? The Inca were doing brain surgery, right? Long before the Europeans were. And this is not a comparison. It's easy for us to fall into that because that's our dominant narrative. Rather, it's a saying of, oh my goodness, if this is what they've been doing, how do we learn from them, right? How do we go to these communities and learn from their scientists? Because their scientists live in the communities. They understand how to work with the natural environment in a way that's systematic, right? They have a method as well. It's not random. It's not suddenly they just figured something out. They also have a very systematic method of doing it, right? It just may look a little different. And that's how we learn from each other, right? And so it's another example of how something is not deemed as okay or acceptable unless it's filtered through this lens of whiteness, right? And so you can begin to see what I'm saying, that it strips everything down to this very small window of how it shows up to the world. And again, for me, the problem with that is we all lose. We all lose when that happens, right? And so we really, really want to be mindful of that and think about how to change that. And finally, the other example I wanted to share was this one of cultural norms. You know, there's this book, and it's very popular, and it's called Happiest Baby on the Block. And one of the things that I was kind of surprised when I saw this book, because I saw that it talked about swaddling, right? And, you know, I come from a tradition that swaddles children. As a child, not only was I swaddled, but I remember being in Bolivia and seeing babies being swaddled, right? And oftentimes they were swaddled on a board, right? And then that way the mom could carry the baby easily, and also they felt that it was good for the bones formation, right? And so it was important to do this. And I remember my father told me that when my sister and I were not only swaddled, but also we you know, slept with them in their bed initially the first few years, that there was such concern about that. And that I'm not sure how it happened, but somehow the social worker got involved, right? And my father, who's very proud of being, you know, Quechua and very proud of his traditions, you know, said to the social worker, absolutely, I'm going to go see the judge. And he said, you know, I'm going to go tell him exactly what I do, because this is what we do in our tradition. And he did. And my father's very forceful. And so the judge, you know, backed down. But those are the experiences that we have, that we're taken to court because we swaddle our children, right? And yet this doctor learned about swaddling. And what he did was he found out that in native cultures around the world, he began to learn, what do they do to calm their children, right? And so he learned that, oh, they swaddle children to calm them. Oh, they make noises like shh, 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 to calm them. Oh, the rocking is actually really important. The holding onto the body is actually important. Things that are like today are very in vogue, like putting your child on your skin, right? Is something that was actually just very natural, right? And so he found this all out and he wrote a book about it, right? And then suddenly everybody's swaddling their children. It's a wonderful thing, right? Now, no one's upset about that they're swaddling their children. However, we had to wait, right, until it got sanitized and it got acceptable by a Western doctor. And then everyone said, oh, okay, now we know it's okay to do these things, right? And again, how long do we have to wait before we can make advancements if we go through this narrow window, rather than collaborate and actually value what other communities have to offer in terms of their own learning and understanding, which have been thousands of years of learning, right? And to that last point, I just wanted to mention, of course, the economic gains, right? You know, bless that doctor, he's had wonderful economic gains. However, you know, when we collaborate, everybody gets economic gains, right? The whole community elevates when we collaborate, not just one or two people, right? Finally, what I want to close with is that I feel like I've said a lot, and I always get, you know, I'm so glad again that we're going to collaborate, because I don't like just talking and talking and talking. I like back and forth. But what I do want to say is that you know, this of all the things that I've shared, I think the most important is, how do we purge from our heart any prejudices or biases that are still there? Because it's not just about watching what words come out of your mouth. I can harbor all kinds of prejudices in my heart, but I can have a really wonderful tongue, right? My tongue can say all these beautiful things. But if I'm still harboring prejudices in my heart, that's the kind of culture I'll create. that's the kind of system I will develop, right? And we're talking about developing new systems here. We're talking about designing new realities, right? So if we truly want to design a new reality, a new culture, then we have to be about removing from our hearts any prejudices, any suspicions, right, that still linger in our heart. And that's very difficult. Any inherent sense of superiority, right, that this system of whiteness in particular gives white people, but also gives people with certain status, right, you know, certain titles, right? We got to remove those things from our heart so that we can just very humbly come to each other and say, how do we collaborate? How do we work together to design this new reality, right? And it's work. It's going to be work for all of us, right? But we all have to be in. And so my closing thought is, you know, nobody gets to be thrown off the planet, right? There's nobody who can say, we don't like this person, we're throwing them off the planet. We can't do that. So therefore, everybody's in. And how do we work together then, if everybody's in this circle, right? And that's the deal. That's the goal.